sound, by the way, my Google Calendar. I want to give a shout out to all the members, by the way, all the new members before we begin. So, Stephen Steele, welcome to the channel as a new channel member, enthusiast level. So, welcome, welcome. So, we're going to talk about, excuse me, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics. I mean, I could continue and continue to do deep dives on this topic for quite a while, on the topic of intelligence. And there's actually quite a good book that I think you should just read. There are actually two good books. Um, One is the now I'm actually it's blanking. I'm blanking on the title. Um, uh, Hold on 1 second. Let me just look at the title again. uh, let's see. Yes. Okay. So the bell curve. So there's a book called The Bell Curve by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. Okay, that is, hey, welcome. Read that, but also read right after it. Read together. Right, it's very important to read these two together. Stephen Jay Gould's classic book or critique of this book, The Bell Curve, which is called The Mismeasure of Man. So a very very good book, and these are all on the topic of intelligence, and they really get into details. You know, the bell curve makes, I would say, a pretty classic argument about how intelligence is genetic and it's innate and it's fixed. It's a fixed quality and it's a real quality, most importantly. But there's a lot of great work. And Stephen Jay Gould, again, he's a really famous commentator on this topic and goes deep into the history of the development of IQ, starting all the way back. A lot of people think that IQ measures started in the U.S. military. It's not really when it started. It goes all the way back to a researcher named Alfred Binet, and French guy, right? French scientist, psychologist, and he came up with the IQ test. Let's just kind of understand this. He came up with the IQ test for really one purpose. It was to identify where a student is in terms of their current intellectual ability, and to be able to find out how to help them in the future, right? Or going forward, like what do they need? What skills do they need to work on? Where can they be further helped in the classroom? He was very very specific about making sure. And by the way, this isn't a whole critique of IQ. Even Stephen Jay Gould, he's very outspoken on that intelligence is not an innate quality, or we can't automatically conclude that. But he's not he's not saying, oh, IQ is not a valid measure. He's not saying that at all. So he doesn't even say that. I'm not saying that. But the point is to understand the role of it because it is misused. So even going back, Binet, the inventor of IQ, the first ever IQ test, he warned, you shouldn't use this as something that is predictive of future. Well, it's not. It shouldn't be something that you use as a label for someone, right? And it's really just to identify where they are, right? So you can't say, okay, this person's IQ is this or this, and then say, oh, he's automatically, automatically like this person's automatically stupid, or this person's automatically brilliant. Or there are a lot of factors that go into this. Now, in recent years, there has been a lot of good research on. So read that book. Read Stephen Jay Gould's critique of the idea of innate intelligence. There are a lot of things to go into. I mean, I could. But actually, some of the most fascinating research to me these days on intelligence is something called, and if you've ever heard of this, there is a difference in terms of looking at heritability, what's called heritability, IQ heritability, meaning how much of IQ is inherited, maybe based on some genetic factors, right? How much of it is inherited? And the very, very importantly, even to this day, there is no IQ gene. Um, let's see. Yeah, okay, so yes, sure. And I think you can definitely make critiques about a lot of Gould's analysis and things like that. Sure. Um, and here's the thing with a lot of these models, these like let's be honest. Okay, let's be real about it. Intelligence, the study of intelligence is not completely 100% scientific. And what do I mean by that? In the first place, um, because here we're just starting. Historically, especially, you're starting with a concept, this kind of airy fairy concept. It's similar to how you study democracy in political science. Well, okay, we have to create that concept, right? We have to somehow come up with this concept. In physics, this is why I like physics, and we go back to physics, and I think a lot of psychological science has tried to replicate physics. It's very difficult though, because physics, we have words like force, we have words like work. Well, how do I define work? Well, work is the integral of force dot the distance. All right, it's very clear what that is. Okay, let's compare that to something like intelligence. Okay, what define it very with a mathematical formula. It's actually not quite that easy. It's not quite that easy. Now, of course, you do have there are such things as there's factor analysis. You can even do things like there's IRT models for intelligence here and there. There are structural equation models for intelligence. What are these hierarchical models for intelligence? Showing causal, with a causal inference and all of these types of things. Sure, but again, there's with these types of models, there are just they're inherently more complex than something. Let's say, again, let's go back to physics. Two gravitational bodies. Well, what's the how can you measure the force of one gravitational body on another? Well, it's a pretty fairly simple equation. Obviously, you can get more complex because even there's error in those equations and things like that. But the more, these are so much more complex models. And the more complex you have of a model, just in general, and social models tend to be, inevitably highly complex. You're modeling something that's highly complex. There's a lot of error. There's a lot more error, and there's a lot more nuance that has to be taken into consideration. In the social sciences in particular, good morning, Nikhil. In the social sciences in particular, in which intelligence is studied, well, let me just give you an example. Let me actually just give you an example. Just even in neuroscience, okay? When you do most studies in neuroscience, or a lot, I wouldn't say most, a lot of studies in neuroscience that model a behavior, let's say of a mouse going through a maze, you can't model. It's impossible to model what each neuron is doing, right? And so you have to do something called dimensional analysis, which is basically you take all these hundreds of millions of neurons, you group them into different categories and regions, and basically you simplify the model so that it basically you know, is somewhat predictive. It's predictive, right? But here's the thing, and we go into there's information theory and these kinds of things. There is information that is potentially lost in the process of modeling in this way, right? There's often information that's lost. Now you did mention James Flynn, Keith Stanovich, yeah, Perkins, yeah. I would like to hear why you think they're far better. I would like to actually. I'm curious about your critique of Gould. I think they both have great ideas, but even within heritability, let's talk about heritability. Something that's very interesting that researchers have discussed these days is the difference between, or actually, people have researchers have started to investigate more and more in recent years is the big question of whether we can consider or whether we can assume that all. If you have a question about anything I'm talking about, by the way, feel free to ask. Um, Whether we can assume that models for heritability of IQ are static, or what you call static, or whether they're dynamic. Okay? So, what do I mean by that? So, a static model assumes that nothing changes, right? So you have that let me put it this way, that the values in an equation never change. And a model is just an equation. I mean, a model is basically an equation or a set of equations, essentially. I mean, I'm oversimplifying that a lot, but basically, when you get down to it, that mathematically, that's what a model means. It's an equation or a set of equations. So basically, do the values change over time, right? Do the values in that equation in that model change over time? And one of the biggest one of Gould's, well, this was not particularly Stephen one of Gould's criticisms, but there's a valid critique to be had, which is that it's a huge assumption to make. One of Gould's major assumptions. Okay, awesome. What's it to you? So, one of Gould's major critiques, one of his major critiques, general critiques in the modeling of intelligence, is that when you look at the majority of the research historically that's been done on intelligence, researchers have typically, unknowingly, actually started with a conclusion, right? Started with assumptions, and then set out to prove those assumptions. And much of the research, because of that, has been circular in a way. All right, of course, you're going to come to the same conclusion if you've already made that conclusion in the first place. So, for instance, and then we'll get back to the idea of heritability of IQ and static and dynamic models. But one example is way back. Okay, they thought researchers thought intelligence is based on the size of the skull, and the race, and different races of people have different skull sizes. And what they would do is, so if like many of the famous researchers of the day, this is just an example, but if the skull, if they found, going through, let's say, a bunch of black people and Indians and whatever, they noticed that there were inconsistencies in the skull shape. Unconsciously, what they do is they would kind of recategorize people racially so that they fit the expectations of what the skull shape should be, the skull sizes should be. So, of course, the whole research conclusion is invalid, right? So let's take a look what you said here. The authors I mentioned are great at steel manning their opponent's arguments and developing their own. Yeah, that's good. Gould would strawman. He was quick to say, yeah. You know what? I actually agree with you. Surrealist, idealist. I agree with you that Gould, he did in some ways strawman. I think I agree with you. But I don't know about that bad faith, because oftentimes I mean, this might be a little bit of a subjective thing, but I think in many ways sometimes he assumes bad faith, but he's pretty clear at certain points. Hey, this person didn't mean to, insert some racist assumption or something like that. They just had that assumption unconsciously, and then that's what the conclusion they came to. So I think in many ways that he's actually balanced there. But I would like some examples of the straw man that he sets out. This is Keenan. This is what is actually intelligence, scientifically, and so forth. What is actually the nature of intelligence, and looking at these models and understanding and critiquing some of the models and looking at some of the strengths of models of intelligence. Let's get back to static versus dynamic models of IQ heritability. Okay, so the static models, typically there are three, like the most popular model of IQ heritability, so to speak, is an equation that is a model that is an equation based on an equation that has three variables, basically. One Bohi, good question. Yeah, Bohi, lots of different books, papers. I try to keep on top of a lot of the research on this as it comes out. I'm always studying. I'm always studying something new. I have no idea, Keenan. I have no idea. I don't think I've ever been tested. What's my IQ? Uh, I don't know. I have no idea. But let's talk about this. So, heritability of IQ, it contains typically uh, three variables. The first variable is heritability itself, right? So we look at the variability, what's called the variability in this variable. Variability means basically, so how much of the variability, when we say how much of the variability of this model is due to IQ, what we're basically saying, shortcut, is how much, right? So if it's like 80% or 60% of this model, or of the variability in this model is due to IQ, right? Can be accounted for by IQ, and then 40% is left over. Right, 40% is left over, let's say, for the other two variables. What are the other two variables? Gene environment interaction, that's another variable, and then environment is another variable. Now these are huge variables. There are quite valid psychometric methods that are used to measure them. We won't get into that. The idea here is that the question of a lot of current research. I haven't finished my dinner because it's not dinner time for me, Uzeb. It's breakfast, past breakfast time, almost lunchtime. So the question is this a a static model where none of these change, or is it a dynamic model where the variables do change over time? Now, obviously, heritability isn't going to change over time, right? Like if you have a certain gene sequence, right, that's not going to change over time, right? I mean, that doesn't change over time. We can know that. So it's pretty safe to say that's not going to change over time. Gene environment interactions. Now that's a very interesting one to study. It's quite plausible that those could change over time. We understand that there's a field called epigenetics in which there are environmental factors depending on what the inside of your cell is exposed to, the outside of your cell is exposed to. There are a whole bunch of extra genetic processes that happen with genetic material, chromatin, etc., that could affect the gene expression. And so that's something that could change over time depending on your environment. There is research that shows that kids that are in a lower socioeconomic status tend to have lower IQs than those in higher socioeconomic status. It would seem prima facie implausible that difference is due to some inherited traits, right? And so maybe something changes over time. These are hypotheses, and it's still being investigated. Jacob, welcome, welcome. Bohi, you took an IQ test, and my reading was average, and my math was high. I think this is because YouTube is my main source for learning. If I use books, my reading score would be higher. Yeah, so that's a question. Typically, you know, there's this whole question of how valid are the IQ tests. They have gotten much better over time. They used to be much less reliable. They used to be more culturally biased, and so one person would score well because they got the pop culture reference, because there's a pop culture reference in there. That's not fair, right? And somebody else didn't from another culture. Well, nowadays they're a lot less culturally biased, but that's potentially a valid critique, but it seems not to change over time too much past a certain age. The research that I'm aware of shows that at an earlier age, you do have a higher, greater ability to change your IQ at a lower age. Still not in such a high, range potentially, but Let's see. A gene for one thing in one environment can also be a gene for another thing in another environment. Exactly. Heritability really means that similar genes in similar environments are most likely to have similar phenotypes. Yeah, right. Exactly. And that's why they include the other variable in this model, which is environment, right? Environment as a variable. Because they are, exactly to your point, with similar genes in similar environments having similar phenotypes. Exactly, right? That is that is why you can't just have in this model heritability and then environment. You do need the gene environment interaction as a separate variable, and that's typically how that's done. So can these change over time? Can any of these variables change over time? If it's a dynamic model, you can imagine the percent of variability due to heritability could actually decrease. Maybe it could increase. And that's, again, that's a lot of the work being done now. To my understanding, that is a lot of the work that's being done now in this field. And it's really fascinating because I do think dynamic modeling makes a lot of sense for intelligence modeling, right? Lamentably, scoring high points in an outdated education system is not really praiseworthy unless your trophies and achievements bring. Yeah, well, see, I mean, yeah, the G factor. The G factor. So now, Bohi, you bring up an important point. So the G factor is, for those who don't know, this is what's considered general intelligence, right? The question is, and it's still a question. It's still a question. Is the let's see, hold on. Even if heritability is 100%, the environment can still change the way all the genes are expressed. People often make yeah, exactly, right? So surrealist, idealist, exactly the point. Exactly the point. Basically, you have to look at how these other variables operate in this model as well. So it's very important. Yeah, so maybe they can be mostly trained. So let's talk about this. The G factor. This is actually a philosophical thing here. All right, let's talk about this. The G factor is what is called a latent variable. I actually have a video discussing this. It's a latent variable. What is a latent variable? It's something that cannot be measured directly. So general intelligence, just as it so what are some other examples of latent variables? Happiness, right? Happiness is a latent variable. Can you measure happiness directly? No, you can't. Learning even is a latent variable. Learning, you think, oh, you can measure learning, but here's how to tell if something is a latent variable or not. It doesn't mean it's not valid, okay? But a latent variable is something, ask yourself, does it have units? So does intelligence have units? Meaning, well, force has units. Newton. A Newton is a measure for force, right? How many newtons does this object exert on this other object, right? How many newtons? Well, that's a measurement for force. So we can measure force directly. You can measure pressure directly, right? Force, over the volume of something, right, is a pressure, right? So basically, here's the thing. Yeah, soft science versus hard science. We just learned this. So here's the thing. We have to be, with things that we cannot measure directly, what do you have to do? You have to do something called factor analysis, which sometimes is extended into something called structural equation modeling. And basically what you do is you measure a whole bunch of, I'm just summarizing this, you take a whole bunch of other things that you think are associated with each other, and you run a test. You run a statistical test. It's called, sometimes mostly it's something called like MLE, maximum likelihood estimation. That's one of the main tests that's used. And you can, run your assumptions through that test of what, how they are associated, and it will come up with some what's called, maximum likelihood, as it's called, right? Of what those associations would be. And then there's something you do what's called load those. It's a whole statistical thing. You load each of those variables onto the latent variable so that you can basically see how they relate in some statistically, I shouldn't say statistically significant, but not that way, statistically significant way to that variable. So you see, this whole process is indirect. And so the question is that G factor that you mentioned, is general intelligence a real thing? Or is it a convenient abstraction we create for the purposes of prediction? Well, it's very clear that at the very least, and that was part of Gould's critique here, is intelligence even a real thing? Like, if so, it would have to be something in the brain somewhere. We'd have to be able to physically study it. Well, where in the brain specifically is intelligence, right? And so I tend toward the idea that intelligence is more like a convenient statistical abstraction so that we can make predictions. And again, you might disagree with me, but I think a good book that solidifies a lot of this idea philosophically is the work of Jonathan Dupre. He's a philosopher of science. Really, really amazing work. I mean, he talks about essentialism. He talks about reductionism, and then he discusses determinism. So yeah, light volume. I just discussed the statistical, basically the statistical understanding of it, and yes. So it's intelligence. I am of the view that intelligence is more like a statistical thing, statistical phenomenon, not so much a. If so, light volume. Show me where. You'd have to show me where in the brain intelligence is. Nobody knows to this day, can point to somewhere in the brain physically where intelligence is. We can model it, talking about, in cognitive science, you can, again, when we talked about this before, you can do dimensional reduction and associate, different factors to, again, a loading, or load them onto a variable, a latent variable. But again, that's a statistical abstraction we use for the purposes of prediction. Again, but it's a philosophical question. Is an abstraction still a real thing? I still think an abstraction can be a real thing. Right now we get into philosophy. I think numbers are real things. I don't think numbers are fake. 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, that's true. I don't think that's these are abstractions still, right? You can't point to 2. You can't point to the concept 2, but I do still think it exists. So can intelligence exist still? Yeah, but you'd be hard pressed to say, well, intelligence is in the brain. It's in the brain. You might be more correct to say it is an emergent phenomenon that it emerges, or an epiphenomenal phenomenon that emerges from the brain, something like that. But you might not find it in the brain. And this is an interesting discussion. We get into mind-brain. So yeah, when has anything emerged from nothing? Well, well, that's not my argument here. That nothing, that something has emerged from nothing. So let's just take a look. Hold on. I'm looking at your comments. There's a lot of correlation between IQ, EQ, and earning career. Yeah, there's some problems with EQ measures though. Still, it's still not an exact kind of thing. But yeah, there is. You're correct. Because it's based on a lot of it is based on questionnaires. Which do have some statistical issues. Like when you look at ordinal data and things like that, you have to do what are called U tests. Those statistical tests, a special statistical test that doesn't take into account the variance because you can't. There's no way to take into account variance with ordinal data. So grading system and marks are worse to test knowledge. I'm looking at all your comments. Carol Lucy here to show some love. Thank you. Thank you. I hope your day is great as well. So quantitative aptitude book suggestions for non-math students. Oh gosh, reach out to me directly. Reach out to me directly and ask me. Surrealist ideals. Yes, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That is a great, yes. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a great place to look for intelligence. So what my claim is not that, and this is again getting into more of a philosophical thing, but and you could be materialist and everything and still hold this position. It's just called emergentism. Out of complex systems, and the brain is a complex system, there are what are called often emergent properties. I'll give you a very simple example. When you have, and let me look at all of the other things here. Yes, it emerged from non-cellular particles. Let's see. Let me see. I feel like there are types of arguments. Okay. Okay. So you got a lot of comments here, but I'll respond to you, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We'll talk about emergent properties real quick. So what's a good example of an emergent property? And this is part of a theory of the brain. And this is not just me. This is Roger Penrose, who's a famous mathematician, materialist, physicist, and he and many others take this position that the brain is a complex system, and certain properties may emerge from the brain, right? So, for instance, intelligence might be one of those properties. He says that maybe quantum physics can account for intelligence. It's not something you might find in the brain, but it is still a property of the brain. Here's an example of an emergent property. If you had, and this is part of Jonathan Dupre's argument against reductionism as well. So if you have, let's say, a baseball team, okay? Let's say what are the things that make up a baseball team? Well, you've got the players, right? You've got the bats, you've got the bases, you've got the ball, you've got maybe the park, okay, something like that. Maybe you don't. Maybe the team doesn't include the park, right? But the team can include the bats, the bases, the people themselves, right? Now, you have the team, right? But if you just say, okay, well, bats plus uniforms plus the people plus the ball plus whatever other gear equals baseball team, it may actually not be the case, right? Can we actually reduce it to just the parts? No, and I don't think there's anything physically paradoxical about that or problematic about that, right? It's just what's called emergentism. You get that in complex systems. I mean, who talks about this? Richard Hofstadter talks about this, right? It's a great, in good old Escher Bach, it's a great book, and he talks about emergent properties, and he talks about loops, right? So strange loops and these kinds of things. So I don't think it's weird, to talk about intelligence as an emergent property that you're not necessarily going to find even right in the prefrontal cortex, right, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right? And even there's actually some very interesting recent research too, showing even more how different brain states. It's not just one part of the brain that produces some result, right? Like a phenomenon like intelligence would be localized. Instead, it seems to be the case, and more research even has come out recently, I can send it to you if you're interested, that phenomena such as intelligence and such as language or other brain phenomena are not localized phenomena. That meaning they're not localized to just one place. So that even complicates it, because then where is intelligence? Well, you might say intelligence is here in the prefrontal cortex, or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but it's also maybe here sometimes, and then other times it's here plus the prefrontal cortex, right? Depending on the state, depending on the time, it gets very, very complex. So but we as humans like the comfort. I think we just have this comfort of we just like the comfort of having one single unified answer for something. I think reality is a lot messier than just having one unified answer. I think we just have to get comfortable with the idea that there isn't one answer for everything. Reality might not be reducible to just this one thing. It might be multiple aspects, or as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, sometimes a spectrum of things. So, what's my worldview? Yeah, people aren't comfortable with shades of gray. I don't know what the worldview means, because worldview is, that worldview. I mean, I see you. I don't see you. Sorry, I don't see you. I see my phone right now, but I don't know what. If you could be more specific, right? My ethics, or what I think about ethics, or whatever. So philosophically. So let's see. Philosophically, it's a longer discussion, and I'm about to wrap up actually. So, yeah, guys. So I appreciate you guys. I really appreciate you guys. People tend to fall into all or nothing thinking. Yeah, exactly. Exactly, surrealist, idealist. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, really good way to, yeah, feel free, Nick, feel free. I actually appreciate any of you guys reaching out to me. This channel is about critical thinking. This channel is not about me having all the right answers and having all the best ideas. You guys can challenge me, right? Challenge my ideas, whatever. And reach out to me if you have further questions, because I know I didn't answer all your questions on this live, but I appreciate you guys for showing up. I'm here every Wednesday. I may not be here next Wednesday because I might be in Yellowstone Park, right? But guys, feel free to check out my Critical Thinking Academy as well if you want to work with me personally, and also feel free to subscribe and watch my videos. So guys, take care, have a great rest of your day, and I will catch you next